Hi everyone, thank you for joining us for our webinar today. My name is Sherwin. I'm an International Approvals Project Manager here at Vista Labs, and today I'm going to be going over EU market access for electronics and electrical products. So this will include countries such as France, Germany, Italy, Spain. There's over 20 countries in the EU. It won't include countries such as Russia, Kazakhstan, and Belarus, which are part of the Eurasian Area Economic Union. And as of now, this will cover United Kingdom with Great Britain and Northern Ireland. Brexit was originally due to take place March 29th, but has since been delayed until October 31st. So for more information on how this will pertain to your products, you may reach out anytime at info@vista-compliance.com. So let's start by discussing what is the CE mark. Conformité European, or the CE mark, is a declaration by the responsible party that product labeled meets the requirements of the applicable EU directives. By fixing this mark, you're taking responsibility of the product's compliance with these directives. The marking is it's an indication, but it's not proof of the product's compliance with EU health, safety, and environmental protection directives and regulations. It indicates to government officials that this product may be legally placed in the market in their country, and ensures that the product has free movement within the EU. It's required in the following countries in the EU. You're responsible for the maintenance of the technical documentation, carrying out the testing, as well as the correct labeling and other items. So if you do decide to place this marking on your product, then you will also permit the withdrawal of the product if it's non-conforming by authorities such as customs and enforcement vigilant authorities. So what are the directives that we will be going over today? There's 3 directives, and they're part of the new EU legislative framework. So the framework is designed to improve the conditions for placing products into the EU market. It was adopted in 2008, and it also aims to boost market surveillance quality and conformity assessment quality, as well as clarifying the use of the CE marking. There's actually over 20 CE directives, but for electrical products, we're mainly discussing the following: Electromagnetic Compatibility Directive, Radio Equipment Directive, and the Low Voltage Directive. So we will be discussing compliance with the requirements of these directives, which are called the essential requirements. So the EMCD covers equipment that can generate or be affected by electromagnetic disturbance. The Radio Equipment Directive, RED, applies to all products using the radio frequency spectrum, and the Low Voltage Directive covers health and safety risks associated with equipment of specific voltage ranges. So as a manufacturer, there's other directives that you or your suppliers may need to be aware of, such as the RHS directive, the WEE directive, battery directive, and so on. But today we're going to be going over these 3 in the electrical and electronic engineering industries. It includes radio equipment, telecommunication equipment, for example, mobile phones, TV sets, power supply units, wireless routers, sensors, and more. So moving on to the EMCD overview, we're going to be discussing a brief overview and background on the EMCD directive. Talk about the mandatory products and products that are exempted from under the EMCD directive, conformity assessment, procedures, requirements, technical documentation requirements, and a little bit about the CE mark, as well as surveillance or post-market surveillance. So a little background on the EMCD. So as we know, electrical devices influence each other when they're close together or when they're interconnected. The purpose of EMC is to keep these things under control. The goal of the EMCD is to reduce disturbance and enhance EMC immunity, and ensure that the equipment doesn't generate or is affected by disturbance. In April 2014, the EMCD entered into force, and from 2016 and onwards, it has since been applicable and replaced the old directive. Um, so what's different is that some products are now added to the scope, such as telecom terminal equipment, and some products are no longer applicable in the scope and has been moved into other directives. So what are the regulated products under the EMC directive? Under this directive, equipment is categorized as either an apparatus or a fixed installation. What is an apparatus? It's any finished appliance made available on the market as a single functional unit intended for the end user and is liable to generate EM disturbance or liable to be affected by electromagnetic disturbance. Examples are computer disk drives, USB memory sticks, household appliances. So a fixed installation is it's a combination of several types of apparatus where it's assembled, installed, and intended to be used permanently at a predefined location. So, for example, air conditioning installations, lighting installations, power supply networks. So, what is exempted under the EMC directive? Um, Equipment without electrical or electronic parts, that's not regulated under the EMC directive. Radio equipment, that's under the radio equipment directive, which we will go over in the next section. Aeronautical products, motor vehicle equipment, medical devices, etc. Inherently benign equipment, which means equipment that's incapable of generating or adding to electromagnetic emissions exceeding the level of tolerance allowed for its operation. So that's EMC emissions. And also is capable of operating without any unacceptable degradation in the presence of other electromagnetic disturbances that's normally present. So this is immunity. So as long as it's capable of these two things, then it's labeled as inherently benign. Custom built evaluation kits. So this is something that would be used by professionals for the purpose of research and development. And other things such as cables, batteries, and corded headphones. These things are exempt from regulation under the EMC directive. So the EMC directive conformity assessment procedure, as you can see here, take a minute to look at that. So some of the terms involved, essential requirements is the first. So the EMC directive sets out the mandatory essential requirements for all the equipment underneath the scope of the EMC directive. It's a full description of the results that needs to be attained, but they don't specify the technical requirements to get there. So that would be in the harmonized standard. As you can see, it's split into two categories: general for all apparatus and specific for fixed installations. Harmonized standards, there's three different types: product specific, product family, and generic. So when you choose a harmonized standard that applies to your product, you'll use a precedence. So first, if there's available product specific standards that pertain directly to your product, then choose that. And then if not available, then a product family standard if that's available. And if that's not available, then you may apply the generic standard. There are situations where you can partially apply a harmonized standard or you don't apply any harmonized standards. And that can happen when there's nothing applicable at the moment for the apparatus. And then the type examination it's a review by the notified body, and you will receive a type examination certificate, and that is optional. So the compliance of the apparatus with the essential requirements is declared finally in the Declaration of Conformity issued by you as the manufacturer, and it's an official declaration of compliance with new legislative laws, and obviously must be signed. So the general idea here is the manufacturer will perform the EMC assessment of the apparatus based on the relevant harmonized standards and essential requirements. that he needs to meet. And the EMC directive, actually, unlike the other directives, it does not require a mandatory intervention from a third party. So there does not necessarily need to be a notified body, such as visitor compliance labs, to review when you're carrying out the assessment. So moving on with the EMC directive conformity assessment process. Initially, there needs to be an EMC assessment done on the apparatus. So a product spec is needed to determine what the harmonized standards apply to the product. So for example, some common standards that apply: EN 50032 2012, EMC for multimedia equipment, that's radiated and conducted emissions, and EN 50024, ITE, immunity characteristics, and they'll consist of tests such as radiated and conducted immunity, burst, surge, EFT, electrostatic discharge. There's obviously there are other harmonized standards. There's a lot, and it'll cover other equipment specific, like household appliances or medical equipment, lighting, etc. Testing for EMC generally takes 1 to 2 weeks and can vary slightly depending on the product complexity, and normally will require one testing sample. So that's to check the compliance with the harmonized standard. And lastly, test reports, that becomes part of the technical documentation that the manufacturer needs to compile and maintain. So as we proceed with the conformity assessment process under the EMC directive, what is included or what needs to be in the technical documentation? So a product identification or specification, a general description of the apparatus, schematics, block diagrams, designs, and any descriptions necessary to understand these documents and the operation of the apparatus. Evidence of compliance with the harmonized standards, if they've been applied, the type examination certificate issued by the notified body, and the EU Declaration of Conformity. So the type examination certificate issued by the notified body, as you can see, after the documentation has been compiled, you can choose to perform the EU type examination by the notified body, where the notified body reviews the technical design and as it pertains to the essential requirements of the EMC directive, and finally issue the type examination certificate to the applicant, indicating that the aspects of the essential requirements have been thoroughly assessed. And any modifications to the approved type that affects the conformity of the apparatus should be communicated with the notified body. So moving on with the conformity assessment procedure under the EMC directive, there is the Declaration of Conformity, which is also part of the final technical documentation that the manufacturer needs to maintain and keep. It's the DOC. It's like a declaration that your apparatus complies with all the relevant essential requirements under the EMC directive, and it's issued by the manufacturer, and that can be based inside or outside the EU, or an authorized representative within the EU. So this is an official declaration of compliance with the legislation signed by the manufacturer or the local or authorized representative. By attesting to this, you assume responsibility for the full compliance of your apparatus as it pertains to the EMC directive. What does this contain? Apparatus model, product identification number or serial number, name and address of the manufacturer, or the name and address of the authorized representative, a statement that the EU Declaration of Conformity is issued under the sole responsibility of the manufacturer. The object of the declaration, which is an identification of the apparatus, It can include a color picture of the apparatus, as long as it shows sufficient clarity for the identification of the apparatus. The statement that the object of the declaration is in conformity with the relevant union harmonization legislation, the notified body name, number, and certificate number if you choose to go the route to obtain the EU type examination certificate. Moving on to labeling and the CE marking. So the CE marking, as we mentioned earlier, is it's an indicator of the product's compliance with the EU health, safety, environmental requirements, directives, and regulations, but it is not sufficient proof. So there's no specific color requirements for the letters or the background. And in other words, it's not required to print the letter CE in black against the white background. But it should definitely be clearly legible, and the CE logo should be clearly visible. And the dimensions, the vertical dimension, should be no less than 5 millimeters. Additional information, identification number, batch, serial number, etc., corresponding to the declaration of conformity is required, and other information such as contact information, the use and installation disclaimers should also be included with the product. Okay, so what is done about post-market surveillance under the EMCD directive? So surveillance, actually member states within the European Union are required to take any and all appropriate measures to ensure that the equipment that is placed on the market has to comply with the requirements of the EMCD directive and continues to comply with the requirements. So as a manufacturer, you must maintain the technical documentation, as we discussed previously, including the declaration of conformity, test reports, for at a minimum of 10 years upon placing the product on the market. So penalties is determined by the member states within the EU. So they'll decide the rules and penalties applicable for any infringements by the manufacturer or distributor, and it's within their jurisdiction to take any measures to ensure that these are enforced. The penalties for noncompliance are generally proportional to the infringement, and it can be increased if there's any previously committed, any previous history of violation. The fines vary from member state to member state and can also include criminal sanctions for anything that's very serious. And obviously, non-compliant products are subject to corrective measures, bans, withdrawals, or recalls. So that about sums it up for the Electromagnetic Compatibility Directive, part of the EU new legislative framework for electrical and electronic engineering industries. As I discussed, there's many directives, but these are the three main that we will be discussing today. Now we will be moving on to the Radio Equipment Directive, which covers and applies to all products using the RF spectrum. So a brief overview of what we will be discussing regarding the Radio Equipment Directive, going over a brief background and overview, discuss the mandatory products and what is excluded, conformity assessment procedure, the technical documentation required, and CE marking, as well as surveillance information. So a little background on the RED. Previously it was called the RNTTE. It's a framework for radio and telecom equipment. And as we all know, telecom terminal equipment is no longer under the Radio Equipment Directive. It has been moved to the EMCD Directive and the Low Voltage Directive. So development on the RED started in 2007. It establishes the framework for placing radio equipment on the market. Also, the RED sets out the essential requirements for safety, health, electromagnetic compatibility, and the efficient use of the radio spectrum. May of 2014, the RED was published and officially entered into force June of 2014, and is now applicable from 2016 and onwards. So some of the changes with the new RED from the old RTTE, so equipment below 9 kilohertz now falls within the scope of the RED, and pure wire telecom equipment, terminal equipment, is now outside of the scope of the RED. So what is regulated under the Radio Equipment Directive? So the kinds of radio equipment, electrical and or electronic product which intentionally emits or receives radio waves for the purpose of radio communication. Electrical or electronic products which must be completed with an accessory such as an antenna, so as to intentionally emit or receive radio waves for the purpose of radio communication. RF modules or radio frequency modules, as well as components that have an embedded RF module, also fits in this definition. Now moving on to the exempted products that are not regulated under the Radio Equipment Directive. So radio equipment exclusively used for activities concerning public security, defense, state security are not regulated under the RED. Radio equipment used by radio amateurs, these are not placed on the market. Marine equipment, airborne equipment, custom-built evaluation kits, which is new to the RED, meaning it's for the purpose of evaluation, research, or development. That is exempt under the RED. Specific and explicitly stated cases in the directive, so that includes antennas, infrared devices, and other equipment. So what does the conformity assessment procedure look like for the Radio Equipment Directive? Again, the essential requirements do apply. There's two types, the ones that are applicable to all radio equipment and the ones that are applicable only to certain types of radio equipment. Applicable to all radio equipment includes the Health and Safety Directive, the EMCD Directive, as well as the Radio Directive. Health and safety is to ensure the protection of the people and protection of property with respect to safety requirements in the Low Voltage Directive, which is Directive 2014-35 EU. The EMC Directive, as we mentioned before, and the Radio Equipment Directive to ensure the efficient use of the RF spectrum in order to avoid any harmful interference. The essential requirements applicable only to certain types of radio equipment. Currently, it's only applicable to radio equipment supporting access to emergency services. Harmonized standards. So in this case, unlike the EMCD, there's only two categories, product-specific harmonized standards or generic harmonized standards. So in this case, you have priority to apply the product-specific harmonized standards if it's available, and if not, then the generic one. So what are the annexes? So Annex 2, 3, and 4 are different ways to show compliance with the essential requirements and different conformity assessment procedures. So Annex 2 is the Declaration of Conformity, where the manufacturer is required to issue the DOC when the compliance of radio equipment with the applicable requirements of the RED has been demonstrated, and they declare that it's their sole responsibility through their own internal production processes and control that the radio equipment that will be placed on the market will satisfy these essential requirements. So it's a declaration of conformity by the manufacturer. Annex 3 is a type examination plus a declaration of conformity. So it's essentially a conformity to the type described in the EU type examination certificate, which is from the notified body review. And the manufacturer declares that it's their responsibility to conform to this type through their own internal production control. And lastly, full quality assurance. The NB in that case needs to perform an assessment to verify the compliance of the actual quality management system of the manufacturer with the relevant essential requirements of the directive. Okay, so moving on with the conformity assessment procedure under the Radio Equipment Directive. So the health and safety essential requirements of the directive. If we take a simple Bluetooth 2.4 gigahertz device, Health and standards that are applicable are EN 62479, 2010, for low power electronic and electrical equipment with the basic restrictions related to human exposure to electromagnetic fields in the range 10 megahertz to 300 gigahertz, as well as EN 62368-1, 2014, audio and video information and communication technology equipment safety requirements. In terms of testing, that will take roughly 1 to 2 weeks. Obviously, it does vary on the equipment, and one sample is generally required. Moving on to the essential requirements, the EMC requirements. So continuing with the example of a 2.4 gigahertz Bluetooth device, the harmonized standard that applies is ETSI EN 301-489-1, version 2.1.1, and ETSI EN 301-489-17, version 3.1.1. So the first one is the EMC standard for radio equipment. So this is an EMC radio standard. It's different than the EMC standard under the EMC directive. So it covers common technical requirements and harmonized standard covering the essential requirements of the radio equipment directive. And the second standard is an EMC radio standard for radio equipment and services, specifically for broadband data transmission systems. And it also covers it's a harmonized standard covering the essential requirements of the radio equipment directive. So again, these are different from the EMC directive standards. These are considered radio EMC standards. For testing, it'll roughly take a week, and again, one sample is required. Okay, so moving on to the radio part. So for a 2.4 gigahertz Bluetooth device, the standard that applies is the harmonized standard ETSI EN 300-328, version 2.1.1. Wideband transmission systems, data transmission equipment operating in the 2.4 gigahertz ISM band using wideband modulation techniques. And again, it's a harmonized standard that covers the essential requirements of the radio equipment directive. Testing for this would be 1 to 2 weeks for the Bluetooth device, but can vary greatly. For 4G cellular devices or base stations that are more complicated, it can take up to 4 to 6 weeks. Test sample, generally one is required. So the technical documentation required consists of the product general description, such as internal and external photos, software firmware affecting compliance, user information, installation instructions. The EU type examination certificate issued by the notified body. So under the RED, if the harmonized standards are not fully applied, then it's mandatory for a notified body to review and issue a type examination certificate. So unlike the EMCD, in this case, there's a situation where the NB review is mandatory. Additionally, the EU Declaration of Conformity is required as part of the technical documentation, and a copy of this needs to accompany each radio equipment product. Declaration that the radio equipment has been constructed so that it can operate in at least one member state without infringing on the requirements on the use of the radio spectrum in that state. In terms of labeling, the CE marking needs to be on the product, and if that's not feasible, then on the packaging. Identification number by type, batch, or serial number corresponding to the DOC. And the CE mark should have a minimum height of 5 millimeters. Additionally, there's information such as instructions or safety info that needs to be in the language of the member state. In terms of compliance with the essential requirements, you can choose to issue a DOC if the compliance of the radio equipment with the requirements has been demonstrated, and you declare that it's the sole responsibility of the manufacturer through their own internal production control processes that the radio equipment put on the market will satisfy the essential requirements. Another way is through Annex 3, which is conformity to type described in the type examination certificate issued by the notified body, and where you still need to have a DOC to declare responsibility through internal production control. So in terms of surveillance, this is similar to the EMC directive. Member states are required to take any and all appropriate measures to ensure that the equipment placed on the market complies with the requirements of the radio equipment directive. The technical documentation must be maintained for 10 years, and the penalties are determined by the member states, and similar sanctions can be imposed and varies from one member state to another. Okay, so that about sums it up for the radio equipment directive. Now moving on to the low voltage directive. This directive ensures that electrical equipment within certain voltage limits are able to provide a high level of protection for the citizens of the European Union. It's actually applicable to a wide range of electrical equipment for both consumer and professional use. For example, household appliances, cables, power supply units, laser equipment, etc. So a brief overview of what we'll be discussing for the low voltage directive, a brief background, and the mandatory products and exclusions, the conformity assessment procedure, technical documentation involved, the CE marking, as well as surveillance. Okay, so a little background on the low voltage directive. It follows almost the same timeline as the EMC directive. It entered into force on April 2014 and is applicable from 2016 onwards. It replaces the older LVD directive for electrical safety. The low voltage directive covers health and safety risks associated with electrical equipment, and the regulated products are equipment that operate with an input or output voltage between 50 to 1,000 volts for alternating current and 75 to 1,500 volts for direct current. Voltage ratings refer to the voltage of the electrical input and output. So to clarify, it's not the voltages that may appear inside the equipment. The low voltage directive also includes both electrical equipment intended for incorporation to other equipment, as well as equipment intended to be used directly without being incorporated. So what is exempt from the low voltage directive? Okay, so electrical equipment for use in an explosive atmosphere, so that actually has its own directive. It's the ATEX directive. And electrical equipment for radiology medical purposes, electrical parts for goods and passenger lifts, again, that one also has its own directive called the lifts directive. Electricity meters, plugs, sockets, outlets, and then fence controllers. So some of these are very specialized, and they would have their own local laws within the member state. Radio electrical interference, specialized electrical equipment, and custom-built evaluation kits designed for professionals and for the purpose of research and development. Moving on to the conformity assessment procedures under the low voltage directive, it's quite simple. There's only one, and it's the internal production control. So the product and quality system assessment procedure is carried out by the manufacturer through its own internal production control processes. It's the obligation of the manufacturer to also maintain the technical documentation, and which includes the declaration of conformity and properly apply the CE marking. So unlike the EMC directive and the radio equipment directive, there's no conformity assessment procedure in the low voltage directive which requires any intervention whatsoever of a notified body. So some of the some harmonized standards you might recognize under the low voltage directive, EN 62368-1 2014 for audio video information and communication technology equipment, and that is to replace EN 60950-1 and EN 60065. So the new approach in 62368 focuses on the known hazards, and it's a risk-based approach, as opposed to 60950 and 60065, which emphasizes the meeting specifications. So the lead time for this safety testing is 1 to 2 weeks, and in general, one test sample is required. So the technical documentation that is required a general description of the electrical equipment, conceptual design and manufacturing drawings of schemes, schematics of components, subassemblies, circuits, bill of materials, a description and explanation necessary for understanding these drawings, as well as the operation of the equipment, results of any design calculations and examinations carried out, such as test reports, a list of harmonized standards applied, and the declaration of conformity. So this should all be kept together and maintained by the manufacturer for 10 years after the electrical equipment has been placed on the market. So a copy of the EU Declaration of Conformity should be made available to the market surveillance authorities upon request. And in terms of labeling, the CE marking should be affixed to the electrical equipment that satisfies the requirements of the Low Voltage Directive. So in terms of market surveillance, if there's any reason to believe that the electrical equipment is posing a risk to the health and safety of the general public, then the surveillance authorities are authorized to carry out evaluations covering the LVD requirements. The LVD requires manufacturers, as well as others in the supply chain, to present the documents to the market surveillance authorities in a language that they understand, which means basically the local language. And they must maintain, manufacturer must maintain the technical documentation for 10 years. Penalties, again, if it's found to be non-compliant, then corrective actions are enforced, such as bringing equipment into compliance or withdrawing it or recalling it for a reasonable period as they prescribe. Okay, so that about sums it up for the EMC directive, the radio equipment directive, and the low voltage directive. Again, these are the main directives under the electrical and electronic engineering industries under the EU new legislative framework. I hope this presentation has been helpful and is able to give you a start on compliance in the European Union. And lastly, thank you for your time. If you have any questions, comments, or suggestions, please send them to us at info@vista-compliance.com. And again, I hope this presentation was helpful and you were able to get some useful, actionable information you can use to get started with product compliance for your products within the European Union. Thank you and have a nice day.